Okay, so I want to start with a quick motivational example that will demonstrate why we're trying to do what we're doing. And then I'm going to do what I call a tour of large-scale statistical inversion. There's a whole lot to this. I could spend an hour on any one of these topics, and I have about a minute and a half for each of them. So I'm going to try and pick out the things that are the most interesting and give kind of a general idea, but in no way is it going to be complete. And then we're going to the thing I think is really cool, I'm going to want to apply it to a global seismic inversion problem and show the kind of results that we can hope to expect from these large-scale uncertainty problems. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're interested in the global seismic inverse problems. This is just one example of an array of seismometers. This particular one's across the US, the EarthScope project. But similar projects exist all around the world. There are seismometers constantly listening to the Earth, small earthquakes that send seismic energy through the Earth to reflect off of any material coefficients in the Earth. And when they arrive at the seismometers, there's all sorts of information about the Earth structure. From this, people have actually reconstructed fairly detailed models of what the Earth's interior looks like. On the left is the usual PREM model, which is radially symmetric and has information about the inner core, outer core, and the Earth's mantle, as well as the density, P-wave, and S-wave speeds as a function of depth. On the right is a slightly improved model called S20RTS by Ritsima et al., which is a laterally heterogeneous correction to PREM. The thing I really want to emphasize here is that in both of these, no uncertainty is specified. And this may not be so much of a problem if there weren't other competing models with, again, no uncertainty specified, and it's really difficult to get any kind of indication from even the people who came up with the models where the uncertainty is, what magnitude it is, what you should believe, what you shouldn't. So we're trying to come up with a method that can actually handle this. To do so, we use the Bayesian formulation for statistical inversion. And as I said, I just want to pick out a couple of things on each slide that I think are important. For Bayesian inversion, we try and describe the solution, our uncertainty in the solution, as a random variable over the parameter space. In our case, the parameter space is going to be this heterogeneous shear wave speed, or P wave speed. And to do so, we need a prior model of the parameters, which I'll discuss momentarily, and a likelihood model that says for any given configuration of parameters, what's the likelihood or probability that we would actually have measured the data that we have on hand. For large-scale statistical inverse problems, we can't possibly form dense covariance matrices. And this is a problem because the way people usually describe smoothing covariance matrices is to actually write down the full covariance matrix, and it's dense. And actually, as you refine the problem, the bandwidth of these matrices gets even worse. And so we need something more scalable to do that. So instead of writing down a dense covariance matrix, we write down an operator in the form of an inverse differential operator. And here, the Laplace term provides some smoothing. Alpha acts like a correlation length. And then you can see at the bottom, we've just plotted some samples of this distribution for a 2D problem. The likelihood model is based on the elastic acoustic wave equation to propagate seismic information. If you note the two Lemay parameters, lambda and mu, come as inputs to this equation. And then we can solve for the elastic strain, elastic velocity, which is what we will measure at seismometer locations at various points in the Earth. These are just some volume renderings of the forward solver. You can see as time goes on, seismic energy propagates through the Earth. And then we can assume that we have some Gaussian additive noise at the sensor locations. And so we have some noise covariance matrix, gamma noise, and f of x is our parameter to observable map that maps the input shear wave speeds and P wave speeds to the output readings that we get at seismometers at our various sensor locations. Once we have this, our posterior expression looks like this, and so this describes our uncertainty in the solution. And the first thing we want to do to characterize this distribution is to find the so-called maximum a posteriori point or estimate, otherwise known as the map estimate. The map estimate is simply the point that maximizes the value of the probability density function. which is akin to minimizing the negative log likelihood, which is this term here. Okay? So this is a large-scale deterministic optimization problem, which people know how to solve. The usual method of choice for this kind of problem is Newton's method, and we can do this in large scale if we can efficiently compute gradient and Hessian information. If you have a way to compute the gradient and a Hessian vector product, so applying the Hessian to a particular vector, then you can solve each step of Newton's method using an inexact conjugate gradient method and slowly arrive at the solution. All right, so just a very quick tour of what's involved in this. These equations the slides get a little bit dense in equations, but what I want to really emphasize is the colors. Red's going to represent the constitutive parameters, which are the parameters we're trying to invert for. So given a set of red parameters, we can solve for the blue parameters, which are the state equations for the forward problem. Once we do that, then the blue parameters come as a right-hand side forcing equation for the adjoint system of equations, which we use to solve for the green variables. This is the so-called adjoint wave equation for people that have seen this. And then using both the green and the blue, we can assemble the gradient at the cost of one additional PDE solve. All right, so this is a tractable thing to do. One more slide of dense equations. The Hessian vector product can be computed in a similar way. If you want to compute in a direction given by this teal-colored C tilde, it comes as a right-hand side for the so-called incremental forward equation, which is one more PDE solve. And we can solve for, is that magenta, I believe, the magenta-colored variables. And then one more iteration lets us solve for the incremental adjoint wave equations and assemble everything together, a fairly complicated expression for the Hessian vector product. All of this is to say that a gradient can be computed at the cost of one additional PDE solve, and a Hessian vector product can be computed at the cost of, say, two additional PDE solves. Okay, so this is something that is scalable. We can do using iterative methods. We're able to compute a map estimate for our problem. Suppose further that we linearize the parameter to observable map around this map estimate once we've found it. So our parameter to observable map now looks like this, where f is the linearization of the forward operator. Our posterior now looks like this. And maybe amazingly, maybe not if you're familiar with this, this is now a Gaussian distribution for the posterior. And the only thing that's left to characterize is the posterior covariance matrix for this operator, which is still difficult because this is a large-scale problem. We can't afford to assemble this dense operator. There's a nice connection, though, that the posterior covariance corresponds to the inverse Hessian of this negative log likelihood operator. And as we just saw, we know how to compute Hessian vector products. We can use iterative methods like length shows to approximate a spectrum of the Hessian. We have some hope of being able to characterize this matrix. There's one more thing we can do, though. We can actually recognize that the Hessian is the sum of two terms. There's a data misfit term, which describes the information coming in from the seismometer data that is the Hessian vector product just described, as well as a term coming from the prior. If you look, so the Hessian misfit term comes from this term, and then the Hessian of this term is just gamma prior inverse. And then we can factor it out into what I call the prior preconditioned data misfit operator, so here in magenta. And this is actually really nice because if we can compute a truncated spectrum for this operator, we only need to keep eigenvalues that are significant compared to 1, because as soon as they fall much below 1, we don't commit that much of a sin by just leaving them out. So if we can compute this spectrum down to the point where the eigenvalues are small, we're done. Well, we have hope of being done. Okay? This is essentially what I just said, that the order of the approximation is essentially lambda over lambda plus 1. When lambda is small, the error is small, and we've done our job. There's other ways that we could potentially think about reducing the dimensionality of the Hessian. One of the things that I'd like to mention is just the randomized matrix method, where you, instead of applying it in Lanczos for an iterative method for the Krylov space. You apply it to a handful of random vectors, and then use that to pull out an approximate spectrum, and that has a lot of interesting implications for our problem. But okay. Finally, for the actual, for all of the visualizations I'm going to show, again, we need to be able to perform these operations without ever needing to form a dense operator. So in particular, we've already discussed that the Newton step can be done without ever needing to form the dense operator. But also drawing the sample, we need something like the square root of the covariance matrix. And we can apply that here. I'm not going to go through the derivation, but it works. And then additionally interesting is a pointwise variance field that will show us as a three-dimensional field where have we learned the most information about our problem and where do we know very little. So, okay. So for the application problems, I'm going to consider two scenarios. In both cases, we'll be inverting for only the CP field, the P wave speed, in the acoustic wave equation. The prior mean will assume that we believe that Prem is the correct model, but that the truth model, the data is generated using the S20 RTS, this laterally heterogeneous model. We have a single source and single receiver, so the source is indicated by this dot on the south pole. The receiver is indicated by this dot on the north pole. We allow for 2,000 seconds of simulation time where the waves will travel through the Earth, and then we hope to reconstruct information about this at the end. For this particular problem, we use about 72,000 degrees of freedom for the parameter space, and we're trying to construct this covariance matrix over these 72,000 degrees of freedom. For the second problem, we have a much more data-rich scenario. We actually have 5 sources, one at the North Pole and then one at each 90 degrees around the equator, and then an array of sensors which cover about a quarter of the Earth. The same underlying problem is used, the same S20 RTS model for the truth and Prem for the prior. And then we solve this on 2 different meshes, one with 10,000 degrees of freedom and one with 30,000 degrees of freedom. And in both cases, these take about 20 hours, 15 hours on 1,000 cores on Lone Star. So, okay. In the first case scenario, the single source, single receiver, if we visualize the prior posterior operator and this reduction of variance term, so I'm only visualizing what we've learned now from the data misfit operator. You can see we learn the most in the area right between the source and receiver, but it's also kind of interesting that we learn a little bit on the back side of the core mantle boundary. The core mantle boundary is one of the strongest reflectors in the Earth, and so there's actually a reasonable amount of seismic energy that will bounce off of this region here before traveling to the receiver at the other end, allowing us to learn some information about that on the other side of the Earth. These are just interesting. These are some eigenvectors of the Lanczos solve that we get, so you can see some structure between the source and receiver. And for the second problem, we do essentially the same type of things. Here I wanted to give some indication of what we see from the deterministic solve. Because we only have receivers on about a quarter of the Earth, the true model is shown on the left, but you see that we can't reconstruct very well the image of the truth model away from the receivers. We just really don't know very much about what's happening in that region. Otherwise, the model is more or less qualitatively correct. The magnitudes are a little bit off, but okay, so this is the same reduction in variance. This is where we learn the most according to our posterior covariance operator. And you see I think this is really cool because you learn the most at every single receiver location, and then you learn a fair amount at each source location, and then near the South Pole you learn very, very little. So it's kind of exactly what we expect, but this is all quantitative now, and these are actual true pointwise values for the posterior covariance. This is exactly how much should I believe my results or not. Just a slice of the Earth, you see we learn again the most very near the surface where the receivers and sources are, and then not so much at depth. Again, I really like these eigenvectors. You can see the first few eigenvectors look like the source modes, and then as you get down to, say, the 100th eigenvector, they become noisy, but they're still significant in our problem. It takes about 400, 450 eigenvectors before they become small relative to 1. So finally, the last thing I want to present is just some samples from the posterior. Again, in the region where we have sensors, we are able to learn about the truth model. And then in the regions, if you can see at the bottom, where we can't, in general, you'll see a lot more variation, red and blue splotches, because we really can't learn about it, and the prior is filling in essentially random information in those regions. Finally, just to indicate, for the last problem I presented on the 10,000 and 30,000 degree of freedom meshes, we get essentially the exact same spectrum. And so this gives some notion of mesh independence for our problem that even as you continue to refine, you won't need more length shows vectors for a much bigger problem. So finally, Bayesian inference provides a quantitative framework for uncertainty. We need scalable priors defined using differential operators, so we never need to form the matrix. We need matrix-free gradient and Hessian vector products for the map estimate and Hessian approximation. We use large-scale local covariance estimates, which we compute via truncated spectral decomposition. And then finally, we never need to form these dense matrices to actually compute samples or the variance field or anything else we might be interested in. We demonstrated this methodology on statistical seismic inverse problems with up to order 10,000 degrees of freedom in the parameter. So many, many thanks. Thanks to everybody here, and I appreciate your attention.